Hi everybody, and welcome again to the third installment of my Arguments Against Creation series. And today what we want to do is look at a third clip of this debate. And here in this particular section, Hovind tries to drive home the point about moral compasses and the difference between, I hate to label it the word with Christian because he does not represent all of Christendom. Many people within the Christian faith disagree with him. But we will, and I don't want to be pejorative or insulting, but for the moment, we will label it as Hovindism, okay? And I don't want that to sound insulting. I don't want that to be interpreted as me attempting to denigrate Kent. I just want to drive home the point that his views are his own, and that he doesn't represent everybody, right? That's basically what I want to do. We will talk a little bit about what he says, and then talk about some of the methodology of science, right? How science is done in practice, and why he's missing the mark in some ways here.
The question was, what's the purpose of life? Okay. Joseph Stalin executed 14,700 Polish officers, prisoners of war, at the Katyn forest. Why did he do that? How do you execute prisoners of war? Adolf Hitler executed at least 6 million Jews, plus millions of others. Why would a person kill Jews? Well, Hitler thought they were an inferior species that hadn't evolved as far. He was actually trying to speed up the evolution process. 1975 to 79, the Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of Pol Pot, executed more than 1/3 of their entire population. Check out the killing fields. Why did they do that? Why were the Australian Aborigines treated like they were animals? Why were Australian Aboriginal skulls dug up out of graves, or people were executed and their skulls were boiled down and they're sold to museums in America to have displays for evolution because they have a bigger jaw than other humans do? Kip Kinkle said, if there was a God, he wouldn't let me feel the way I do. There is no God, only hate. Well, on May 21st, 1998, 15-year-old Kip Kinkle, a student at Thurston High School in Oregon, entered the cafeteria, fired more than 50 rounds from a semi-automatic rifle. 26 students were injured, 2 were killed. Later, the bodies of his parents were found in his home. He was arrested, taken to a police headquarters where he attempted to murder a detective. He said, if there was a God, he wouldn't let me feel the way I do. So there's no God, only hate. Why have violent crimes increased nearly 1,000% since I was a boy? And that's the time evolution became a popular theory in our textbook. Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris made a video prior to the Columbine shootings. They're talking about a football player. They said he doesn't deserve the jaw evolution gave him. Look for his jaw. It won't be on his body. Klebold's father was a geologist who believed in evolution. Both Eric and Dylan were followers of Nazi teachings. The shooting took place on Hitler's birthday on purpose. It was planned to commemorate Hitler. Eric's t-shirt said natural selection. They killed Cassie and Rachel just because they were Christians. They killed Isaiah just because he was black. Hitler hated black people. After all, they hadn't evolved as far. That was Hitler's thinking. The clothes may give a clue to the thinking of these teenagers. Said natural selection. Yes. What about this natural selection? Well, natural selection selects. It doesn't create a thing. It selects. That's all it can do. It's not a creation process. We go into that some other time. So my answer to the question is there a purpose to life? Absolutely, there certainly is. God created this universe with a plan. He created man with a purpose. Now, I have found in my speaking on this topic about 800 times a year all over the world and 15 years worth now, the reason people accept the evolution theory is not because they have a scientific reason. I asked a kid 2 weeks ago, I was debating two professors, or I forget where I was, it doesn't matter, 3 weeks ago. One kid came afterwards and said, evolution's a fact. I said, well, calm down, let me ask you a question. If evolution, if creation was true, if the creation story is true, would that affect your lifestyle any? If there was a creator that said, thou shalt not commit adultery, no pornography, no lying, no cheating, no stealing, would that affect your lifestyle any? He said, you're trying to embarrass me, aren't you? I said, I don't even know who you are, I'm just asking you a question. The reason people accept evolution is because of their sin, not their science.
There's a lot to unpack here. So, one of the main fallacies, he's committing two very atrocious fallacies. Maybe more, but I detected two major ones. And if these were ever put in, if anybody were to detect these fallacies in your published work as a scientist, and it was demonstrated that you intentionally committed these, it would be absolutely devastating to your career as a scientist, if not kill it outright. And the first is drawing correlation equaling causation. Darwin's theory of evolution becoming popular, whatever that means. He doesn't specify what becoming popular means. How incorporated it was into textbooks before he was born versus after. The ratio of textbooks that talk about it. The truth is that within the biological community, shortly after Darwin published, biologists and biology educators were talking about evolution a lot, and specifically the natural selection aspect of it. There were multiple people, right, that contributed to what we call the theory of evolution now. Darwin didn't create it in a vacuum by any sense. But he was the one who collated it into a comprehensive structure, right, under the umbrella of natural selection. I believe I have that right. If any biologists watch this and want to correct me on that, then feel free. So I don't know what he means by that, but so he's trying to draw this idea that if you believe in evolution, or accept, I shouldn't say believe in evolution because that gives it a religious tone. What we try to say when we're not speaking colloquially about it is accept evolution as the best idea we have right now for how life has changed over time on this planet. That's a bit longer winded than saying believe in evolution, but that's much more accurate. That's how it should be addressed. Because again, and I've said this previously, if a better idea came around tomorrow, we would say okay. And if that idea were vetted out and proved to be useful and had more explanatory power, had more predictive power, then evolution, we would change, we would adjust. So we don't say we believe in evolution, or that, and you shouldn't say that evolution is a fact when talking about it as a scientific theory. But what you can say is that it is a very well tested and rigorously tested, with mountains of evidence from multiple branches, from genetics, from observations of several different organisms, the fossil record, pretty much every string of evidence that we have um, points to the fact that it's consistent with the tenets of evolution via natural selection. Um, but the point here is that he's trying to make the case, right, that if you accept evolution, you're going to lose your moral compass and you're prone to doing horrible things like committing genocide or school shootings and those kinds of things. Um, I'll say more about correlation and causation in a moment because I want to actually make the other point first, but that was the first one to get out of the way. Um, the bottom line is that he's confusing correlation and causation. So he's claiming that as um, the acceptance of evolution has increased, this type of moral violence has increased. And those who are perpetrating the violence is correlated with their belief in evolution. That's the case he's trying to make. That's what we call a spurious correlation. Um, and most of the rest of the video will be devoted to that particular topic. But for the moment, the second fallacy scientifically that he's making here is he's absolutely cherry picking his data. Um, he's absolutely cherry picking those statistics. Number one, um, somebody believing or wearing a T-shirt advocating for a scientific idea and then going and committing a horrible act, murder, mass murder, school shooting, whatever the case may be, is not in any way, shape, or form evidence that that idea, what he was wearing on his shirt, was the cause for it. And it certainly is not proof that that idea is toxic. Um, it very well could be that he was simply a disturbed individual and he was going to do that horrible thing one way or the other. And perhaps a misguided view of evolution may have contributed to that. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on that because I haven't read much on that particular case, on that particular school shooting. I don't know what was going on in that individual's minds or in the minds of the two students at Columbine. Um, but there's two things that we can point out, and that is number one, if you're going to claim or try and make the case that evolution leads to atheism, which leads to um, horrible acts like school shootings or genocide, then you have to explain, number one, why there are people that we would by and large consider to be very moral people who are atheists. And number two, you would have to, or more specifically, who accept evolution. And number two, you would have to explain why there are religious people who do very horrible things, people who claim to be religious. And you can you don't have to search high and low for examples where people who claimed to be Christians did very horrible things on the scale of anywhere from individual murders and rapes up through genocide. Um, so if Kent wants to go down that road, I would ask, what about the Inquisition techniques in the 16 and 1700s? Maybe even in the 1500s, where people were being burnt at the stake for things today that we would accept as common knowledge, such as their beliefs in the potential for other worlds to exist. We now know of thousands upon thousands of exoplanets, and yet people were burned by the Roman Catholic Church for believing just that. Um, all of the heresies that the church, the Catholic Church, was afraid of in the 14, 15, 1600s. Um, Today we wouldn't even bat an eye, even if we disagreed with them theologically. We wouldn't bat an eye at allowing them to believe what they're going to believe. We might try to discuss with them in a civilized, hopefully civilized manner, and share our views and discuss why I believe one way and why they believe in another. Um, but if we want to talk about horrible things, then we have to talk about that. Um, we would have to talk about the near genocides that occurred on this continent against indigenous peoples, by and large by people who claimed to be Christian. We would have to talk about sex abuse within the church. We would have to talk about any of the abuses, human rights violations done in the name of any religion. If you're going to say that atheism is what makes you, or acceptance in evolution is what turns you away from having a moral compass, then there are other religions around the world who don't embrace evolution, and people in those religions have done a lot of good things for humans. There's a lot of compassionate people out there. There's people in other religions who've done really horrible things. And to me, that points to the idea more that people are simply people, and it doesn't matter what theological or sociological construct you build for them, um, or ask them to embrace. It simply means that, statistically speaking, in any population of people, you're going to have bad people. And bad people can be religious, bad people can be atheistic, bad people can be agnostic, bad people can be heterosexual, bad people can be homosexual, bad people can be pansexual, good people can be heterosexual, good people can be homosexual, good people can be pansexual. Um, those types of labels don't define your person or your moral compass, and it's fallacious to try and assign a moral compass based on those types of things. So when he says things like, um, or he tries to draw the conclusion that these people did these bad things because they accepted evolution, you have to explain. Otherwise, you have to explain all of human behavior and explain why priests have molested children. You would have to explain the horrific abuses children in certain private religious schools have endured at the hands of teachers and administrators. Um, you have to explain all sorts of things, and it's just not a can of worms that one should open unless they're really prepared to go down that rabbit hole. And it's certainly not a scientific discussion, right? So again, the whole point here is that he is um, trying to bring these philosophical and theological views into a science debate without backing them up, and without context. So it's just bizarre, some of these places he's going in this debate. Um, and cherry picking, when you just cherry pick your data and say, okay, here's my entire data set, Here's the conclusion I want to draw. Which pieces of data can I pull out of my data set and allow me to draw that conclusion? Um, this is completely antithetical to the scientific method. Um, Within the scientific method, you have to um, accept all of your data as long as you don't have any experimental reason or observational reason to reject it, and you don't have any instrumentational reason to reject it, and you don't have any statistical reason to reject it. Um, if your data, no matter how messy, passes those three tests, you put it in your conclusions. You have to include it in your analyses. Um, it's just intellectually dishonest not to do so. And anybody caught doing that, it's one thing to fall for correlation versus causation. I should amend my statement from earlier. You might not necessarily get kicked out of the scientific community for falling for a correlation versus causation argument. You might get ridiculed or laughed at or rebuked in the literature. You might have to endure being the butt of a couple of jokes at talks and conferences and things. But won't necessarily stop you from being able to publish future research and things like that, um, unless it's an absolutely egregious error. But cherry picking your data and what cherry picking data ultimately amounts to is falsifying your results, because usually, almost in every case, cherry picked data means that when you take the full consideration of your entire data set into account, it does not conclude what you were hoping it would conclude. And you already have a preconceived notion of what the data ought to say. And so you just ignore, without explaining anything, why, or you ignore the data that doesn't work, that doesn't fit your preconceived model. And models need to be driven by data, not the other way around, right? Models are driven by the data and by experimentation and observation, not data and observation being driven by models. Now, that doesn't mean that models can't inform how we collect data, but we always have to go into an observation or an experiment with the belief that our data might falsify our model. No matter how well tested it is, we have to go in with the acceptance that it could falsify our model. Now, I'm not worried, okay? If I were to have a golf ball in my hand and I were to drop it, I'm not worried about whether it would float in midair or whether it would fall. Um, the principle that things fall toward the earth under the influence of gravity and absent any other external upward thrusting forces has been so well tested at this point that I have every confidence that it would, the golf ball would still fall. If it didn't, then that would be absolutely remarkable, right? If my golf ball didn't, and I could somehow demonstrate sufficiently that it didn't fall, and there were no magic trick illusions, there were no external influences, there was nothing, um, there was no other forces acting on the ball, and it would just floated there, here in my living room, that would be 100% remarkable. It would be absolutely remarkable. So we have to entertain the possibility that even if we have a model and a well-tested one, that it could be falsified. The more we do things in a specific way, like dropping golf balls, and the more those golf balls fall, And not only do those golf balls fall, but they fall measurably at the same rate. The more we do that, the more confidence we have that Newton was correct. Okay? Um, so we can have very high confidence in a lot of our theories, models, and ideas. Um, and cherry picking destroys that confidence. When you have a study that has a groundbreaking result and it's later found that the data was cherry picked, what that usually means is that the author or authors of that study, if caught, um, by statistical analysis or by future studies not being able to replicate the results, or however the study may be called into question, if it's found that data were purposefully cherry picked, it usually means the end of the careers of the scientists who cherry picked the data. It I need to be very specific. It usually means that those scientists are no longer welcomed to submit research to peer-reviewed, reputable journals. It doesn't mean that you won't be able to make a living as a fringe pseudoscientist on the internet. Unfortunately, a lot of people are able to make money that way. Um, but you aren't accepted in the reputable reputable scientific community anymore. So that's cherry picking, and it's 100% fallacious. It is absolutely fallacious. Um, and it deservedly so. Okay, that's what I was looking for. It's fallacious, and the punishments are deserved. In science, the only way science works is with the integrity of the experimenters when they're reporting their results to journals, um, to be accurate and honest. Okay, about what they did and how they did it. That doesn't mean that some fudging doesn't happen from time to time, if not sometimes. But there's a difference between um, using certain statistical analyses to see things in different ways versus absolutely ignoring large chunks of your data set, um, or changing the values of your data points. Uh, that is career suicide if caught. Um, and Kent is absolutely making that blunder here. And then the correlation part. Um, he wants to correlate an acceptance of evolution with a degradation of culture, if you will. People are more likely to commit school shootings. People are more likely to um, uh, do horrible things, commit genocide, or whatever the case may be. Um, People have been doing those things long before evolution was ever proposed. If you look at the history of Europe, if you look at the history of the Arab countries, if you look at the history of Greece and Italy and um, the empires that grew out of Mesopotamia and then Greece and Persia and then Rome, all of them committed horrible crimes against humanity in ways, some ways. Um, Pretty much any empire that has ever existed got to be an empire in part by conquering people and committing crimes against humanity. So if you want to make the correlation oh, person X believes in evolution and they committed some horrible act, then you have to explain why people were committing horrible acts long before evolution was ever proposed formally by Charles Darwin. You have to explain um, why many people throughout history have seemed to lack what we would term a moral compass. Um, and it doesn't matter, what era they lived in or what country they lived in, who they were. Um, History is replete with people doing bad things, just as it's replete with people doing really good things. So it's a very very hard argument to make and say, okay, so person X committed act Y and they believe in evolution, therefore evolution caused act Y. Um, that is a correlation causation fallacy. So when we talk about correlation and causation, what are we talking about? So when you have two data sets or even just two events, event A and event B, and event A happens and then event B happens, and you ask the question, okay, did event B happen because event A happened? And sometimes perhaps it does. Um, um, it's possibly going to snow tonight, right? And snowy weather, cold weather, is correlated with a higher correlation of dead car batteries. Okay, so if you looked at the number of cars in a big city that don't start the next day after cold temperatures hit, that's going to be a higher ratio than any other given day during warm weather. And so that is an example of causation, right? Your battery is more likely to not work in your car and be dead because of the colder temperatures, and that is a causation. That is an example where two things are correlated, and we have a causal mechanism for them. Um, Kent is obviously arguing that their lack of belief in um, Havendism is what's causing their lack of moral compass. And again, I say Havendism only because his particular view of Christianity is not shared by Christianity at large. Parts of what he believes are shared by several different denominations, but his entire brand as a whole sum of theology is not accepted by everyone in Christendom. So when you say that these two things are correlated and therefore one has to cause the other, um, it's simply fallacious reasoning unless you can explain mechanistically and with a model why they are causally related, right? And so we know of several types of data sets that are highly correlated with each other, and yet there's not a direct causal link between them. Um, there may be third party links, or they just may be random coincidences. And I would actually argue in this particular case, the cases that he cited, it is random coincidence that these people did these horrible things and happened to also accept evolution. Um, his use of Hitler is also a little bizarre to me. Hitler is not a person that I would argue anything theologically or philosophically about. He was such a complex character in his personal beliefs and his behaviors that it's hard to necessarily parse out exactly what Hitler believed about a number of things. Yes, it's true he viewed the Jews as lesser people, if people at all, but outside of that, when people talk about, whether he was an atheist or not, that's a very complex issue, and I would hesitate to really argue anything on that point without being a historian who has studied his life in some detail, or a sociologist who's studied his life in a lot of detail. Um, but the others, the school shooting individuals, or the young man who um, said if there's a God, he wouldn't allow me to hate like this. Um, when you're talking about billions of people being on the planet and millions, hundreds of millions being in the United States, of course, sooner or later, you're going to find somebody or a group of people um, who do something that you can blame some philosophical idea for. That's just statistics. So, and especially since he only gave three, um, out of all of the number of people who have committed horrible murders, mass shootings, and so on, um, three is not a statistically significant number of just those individuals, let alone the entire 300 million people in the United States right now. Um, so using that is an extremely cherry picked set of data, an extremely cherry picked set of data. And if he wanted to draw this conclusion from a firm statistical standpoint, I would say what he needs to do is interview or poll or somehow gather data on pretty much every murderer in the United States, and he would need to do it from right around 1880 up through now, and look at the frequency of incidents per person. Was somebody who's lumped into this violent offender group, hypothetically violent offender group that we're talking about, um, how many incidents did they get away with before they were either killed themselves or arrested by law enforcement? And then you would also want to look at, um, um, ask them what drove them, right? What drove them? And I'm making hypothesis here. This is complete conjecture on my part, but my guess is that the idea of evolution would hardly come up in any of these discussions. And if it did, that I'm guessing that it would be an outlier. Now, again, I don't have any evidence to back that up. This is just thinking through what initially makes sense. But if I could do this test, then I think it'd be a really interesting test to do. Unfortunately, it's not possible because most of the people that we would need to poll are dead. Um, because whatever year it was that he talks about evolution becoming popular, you would want to talk to people before then and people after then and compare motives, frequency, opportunity. Um, you know, was religious upbringing any factor in their psyche slash psychosis? Um, were they abused as children? We're understanding now that, the experiences that a person has as a young person in the home, um, especially if there's extreme abuse, is quite devastating to those individuals and potentially harmful later in life. Um, with high rates of things like alcoholism and drug use. So, there's so many lurking variables in such a data set that to just simply say it's evolution, especially once again with the cherry picking of not taking religious people who've done horrible things into account, or atheists who reject evolution. What about them? Have any of them done horrible things? Have any of them done really good things? Have any of them um, uh, done something of note on either end of the spectrum, extreme end of the spectrum, that would be worth noting? So with so many lurking variables, it's just a really tall order to dig into those types of things, and I would caution against anybody from drawing any correlation, meaning causation conclusions on three data points out of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. Um, if you're talking about violent people who are willing to commit random acts of violence in this country, I would guess that there's probably thousands in this country right now who would fit that description. And so then when you look at the history of the country, hundreds of thousands. And so, again, what do you do with the people who lived before this supposed popularizing of evolution? He doesn't talk about any of it, all of this. So let me give some context to this. Um, this is something that I've shown my students in the past, and here we have a plot, and so this data was taken from the World Almanac and the Book of Facts, and it was plotted in a simulation website called PHET, PHET, run by the University of Colorado. And so what we have here is the average number of people per TV versus life expectancy, right? So you have by country. So each data point represents an individual country. And as you might guess, right, the higher you go on the graph, these are your more affluent first world countries, and these are your poorer third world countries, right? And so in some countries you have one TV, or I'm sorry, not one TV, but maybe 55 TVs per 600 people, right? So maybe roughly one TV per 10 people. Oh, no, 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 I'm sorry. This is the life expectancy axis. This is number of people per TV. So yes, this is 600 people per TV. And in that country, I don't know what country this is, but in that country, you've got a life expectancy of about 55 people. Does this mean that as countries buy and distribute more TVs, that sitting around TVs increases your life expectancy? No. But this is a very strong correlation, right? As you get more TVs, your life expectancy shoots up. Um, and of course, that's just simply a false line of reasoning. We know that TVs, by and large, do not have any medicinal effects of their own. And in fact, of course, the current buzzword is we want to reduce screen time, be it for children or adults. Um, so, if you were to just strictly draw a causation mechanism from this correlation, you would say, oh, we need more TVs. Okay, but what are the underlying issues? Okay, what are the lurking variables, and what are the potential variables that are connecting these two? into a picture that makes sense? Well, probably the most likely idea is the more money in an economy, the more per capita income, and the higher net income that a given household has, the more they're going to have, number one, luxuries like more TVs in their home, and number two, affluence, affluent countries generally have higher quality medical care. And higher quality medical care indicates longer life expectancies. Um, so it's more of an economic connection than anything about TVs emitting magical healing rays that we should all just sit around TVs and be healed of our conditions that would shorten our lifespans. If you were to take this graph at face value, that's what you would conclude, and that's an absolutely fallacious line of reasoning. There's a wonderful website, um, a spurious correlations website, tylervegan.com, and this website has some really, really great sets of data in it. And this was written by a number of years ago. This was written by a graduate student at a Harvard Law School. And he basically wrote some code that data mined different publicly available databases and then just ran those databases against each other and looked for things that showed any correlation. And this is one of my favorites. The divorce rate in Maine correlated with the per capita consumption of margarine. And as you can see, both of these, and even each bump over this 10-year data set is mirrored between the two sets of data. Um, and the correlation coefficient here is really, really high, which is really fascinating. But again, if you were to take this at face value, right, you would say, wait a minute, we need to eat less margarine, right? If we want marriages to last in Maine, then we around the country need to eat less margarine. And that's just simply an absurd um, conclusion, right? That's just simply an absurd conclusion. Um, if I eat margarine here in my apartment on a piece of toast, or use margarine in my cooking or baking or what have you, um, that in no way, shape, or form is going to demonstrably affect how marriages in the state of Maine um, behave, and whether they stay stable, whether couples stay together, whether couples get divorced. Um, there could be third party connections, um, just the same as we know that ice cream sales are correlated with shark attacks. Um, but that doesn't mean that if you buy ice cream that a shark is going to attack someone around the world. That doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that as weather warms up, more people are going to go buy ice cream from ice cream stands or from the grocery store, and more people are spending time in the water during the summer months. So it's there is a connection there, but it's not ice cream causes shark attacks. One of the great things about this website is it has all of these different correlations, but you can build your own correlation. You can correlate different things. Um, One of the funnest ones to do is this one called interesting variables. And so you want to view your variables, and you can see just some of the random data sets that the website has pulled. Um, and I did this in this tab here, and I correlated the total revenue generated by bowling alleys and the per capita consumption of sour cream. Now, this isn't quite as highly correlated as the margarine and divorce rates in Maine, but it's still really highly correlated for a 10-year data set. We would definitely consider this as a statistically significant correlation. And as a result, if you wanted to, you would conclude, okay, if I want bowling alleys to succeed, then I need to go eat sour cream. Okay. And the reason I'm harping on this is because this is exactly the line of reasoning that Hovind is using. And it's absolutely spurious and it's absolutely fallacious. So please, please, please do not fall for any line of reasoning where someone gets you to try and draw a conclusion based on a correlation alone without any further indication of why that correlation should be true or demonstrate that there's at least why the causation exists. Okay. If somebody wants to argue correlation equaling causation, it has to be evaluated on a case by case basis, and it must be shown sufficiently. Okay, it must be shown sufficiently. Um, I'll give you an example from my own field. Okay, I'm an astronomer, and I am studying pulsating stars, and I'm studying a specific class of pulsating star. And we are looking at pulsating stars in binary systems, or when two stars are orbiting around each other. And we have correlations of the pulsation periods, or how long it takes a star to breathe in and out, correlated with the orbital periods of the two planets. Okay? And these two quantities seem to be correlated. But nobody to date has yet been able to explain a causal mechanism. Okay? So for the moment, as much as we think that there is some connection between the extra gravity that the pulsating star is feeling, it's not just feeling its own self-gravity, it's feeling the gravity of its companion. We think that the gravity is what's responsible for, the extra gravity is what's responsible. But we don't know how, and we don't know why. So for the moment, it's simply a correlation, and people are working on this. We're trying to find out if there's a causal mechanism. We would love to find one. And there are some ideas, but nobody has been able to firmly show it yet. So, even when you're talking about, peer-reviewed scientific research, you still have to take caveats into account. Am I actually looking at a causally connected set of data? Or is it possible, if not likely, that what I'm seeing is just a correlation? And when you see just correlations without a causal mechanism, there's one of two options. Either the causal mechanism is a third or a fourth or set of other things, like the weather when thinking about ice cream and shark attacks, or it's pure coincidence. And you have to be willing to entertain both of those ideas to firmly evaluate your results. So, with that in mind, we will close out this video, and I hope that you guys have found it helpful and useful, and we will see you guys next time.